Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Massachusetts. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The town of Hollister, Massachusetts, doesn't appear on modern maps. What remains of it lies submerged beneath the Quabbin Reservoir, constructed in the 1930s. But long before the waters claimed it, Hollister harbored secrets far darker than the murky depths that now conceal its foundations. In June of 1902, a telegraph arrived at the Boston office of Dr. Edmund Pierce, a respected physician at Massachusetts General Hospital. The message was brief but urgent. Family matter requires immediate attention. Come alone. A.H. The initials belonged to his estranged cousin Abigail Hollister, whom he hadn't seen in nearly 2 decades. What puzzled Dr. Pierce wasn't the summons itself, but rather its timing. According to county records later examined, Abigail Hollister had been declared legally deceased 3 days before the telegraph was sent. The Hollister estate stood isolated on the northern edge of town, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through dense pine forests. According to the local postmaster's ledger, no mail carrier had delivered to the mansion in over 4 months. The last documented visitor, a representative from the First Bank of Worcester, noted in his report that he left without completing his business after waiting at the door for over an hour. The house, he wrote, seemed to breathe with a rhythm not its own. What Dr. Pierce discovered upon his arrival would lead to one of the most disturbing investigations in Worcester County history, one that officials would eventually seal from public record in 1963, citing concerns of potentially disturbing historical precedent. The Hollister family had been among the wealthiest in western Massachusetts, their fortune built on textile mills along the Swift River. Local archives contain mentions of their unusual privacy and the strange architectural modifications made to their estate over 3 generations. Tax records from 1887 indicate payments for subterranean expansion and specialized ventilation systems not typical for residential properties of the era. According to the Worcester County Historical Society's records, the night Dr. Pierce arrived at the Hollister estate, the temperature dropped to an unseasonable 48 degrees. The groundskeeper's log, recovered years later, describes an unnatural stillness, as though the house were holding its breath. The journey to Hollister had been unsettling for Dr. Pierce. Train records from the Boston and Albany Railroad confirm his departure from North Station at 7:15 a.m. on that June morning. His personal journal describes the countryside growing increasingly desolate as he traveled westward, with fewer passengers at each stop until he was alone in his compartment by the time he reached Worcester. There, he transferred to a local line that wound through the hills toward the Swift River Valley. The conductor on this smaller train, according to Pierce's notes, seemed reluctant to call out the Hollister station. When Pierce inquired about hiring transportation to the Hollister estate, the man's demeanor became noticeably tense. "You won't find anyone willing to take you after sundown," the conductor reportedly advised. "Best wait till morning if you must go there at all." Pierce dismissed this as rural superstition and eventually secured a ride with a local farmer who agreed to take him as far as the town's main street, but refused to approach the estate itself. The farmer maintained a rigid silence throughout the journey, breaking it only once to comment, "The Hollisters keep to themselves. Best that others do likewise." The town of Hollister itself presented an eerie contrast to the bustling industrial centers that dominated Massachusetts in the early 1900s. While factory towns like Lowell and Lawrence teemed with immigrant workers and the constant noise of industry, Hollister exhibited a peculiar quietude. The storefronts along the main street appeared well maintained but oddly vacant, with few pedestrians despite the early evening hour. Town records show a steady population decline beginning in the 1880s, accelerating through the 1890s. The census of 1900 listed just 347 residents, down from 612 in 1880. Local newspapers attributed this exodus to the gradual closure of several smaller mills along the river, though they offered no explanation for why these businesses had failed, while the Hollister textile operations continued to thrive. What happened during the next 72 hours would fundamentally alter the course of Dr. Pierce's life. He would never return to his medical practice. A colleague who visited him in 1905 at his new residence in Vermont wrote in a private letter that Pierce appeared aged beyond his years, startling at the slightest sound, and refusing to speak of his family connections. The colleague observed that Pierce kept every window shuttered and mirror covered, regardless of the hour. The Hollister estate stood 3 stories tall, with a facade of weathered brick and narrow windows that seemed to observe the approaching visitor with calculating indifference. According to architectural plans filed with the county clerk's office in 1867, the mansion contained 23 rooms, though Dr. Pierce's subsequent notes reference at least 31 distinct spaces within the house. This discrepancy has never been officially resolved. As twilight descended, Pierce approached the estate on foot, his medical bag in one hand and a small valise in the other. The gravel drive leading to the main entrance was immaculately maintained, lined with ancient elm trees whose branches created a canopy that blocked much of the fading daylight. Pierce noted in his journal that despite a light breeze evident in the swaying of the uppermost branches, no sound of rustling leaves could be heard. "It is as though," he wrote, "the property exists within a pocket of unnatural stillness." The front gate stood open, their wrought iron surfaces displaying the Hollister family crest, a design that Pierce described as a peculiar arrangement of interlocking circles, giving the unsettling impression of something viewed through a microscope rather than a traditional heraldic emblem. County historical records confirm that this unusual crest had replaced the family's original coat of arms in the mid-1830s, shortly after William Hollister's unexpected return from a research expedition to Egypt. Inside, Dr. Pierce found the main hall draped in black crepe, a traditional mourning decoration. The air carried the distinct scent of beeswax candles and something less identifiable that he described in his journal as reminiscent of the medical preservation chambers at Harvard. No servants greeted him. The only sound came from an antique grandfather clock at the end of the hall, though, according to Pierce's notes, the hands remained fixed at 3:47 regardless of the actual time. The entrance hall featured an ornate marble floor arranged in a pattern similar to the family crest on the gates, concentric circles interconnected by what appeared to be organic branching structures. Pierce observed that walking across this pattern induced a subtle sensation of vertigo, as though the floor were slightly uneven despite appearing perfectly level. A large portrait dominated the far wall, depicting a severe-looking man identified by a brass plaque as Thomas Hollister, the family patriarch who had established their American line in the late 18th century. Pierce noted the unusual quality of the painting, particularly the eyes, which seemed to have been rendered with a technique that created the illusion of depth beyond what should be possible on a flat canvas. Abigail's letter of invitation, discovered later in Dr. Pierce's personal effects, directed him to make himself comfortable until the appointed hour. It specified no particular time. The letter concluded with a peculiar postscript: "The lower chambers are not to be disturbed. What sleeps should remain so." Town records indicate the Hollister mansion had been constructed atop the foundations of an earlier structure, with portions of the original stone basement incorporated into the new design. A surveyor's report from 1863 notes unusual acoustic properties in these lower sections, with sounds carrying in ways contrary to natural expectation. The report also mentions a separate entrance to these lower levels, accessible only from the family cemetery, located on the eastern edge of the property. The Hollister fortune had not always been centered on textiles. According to business ledgers preserved in the state archives, the family's earliest American ancestor, Thomas Hollister, established himself as an importer of medical curiosities and preservation materials from Europe in the late 1700s. These imports included specialized chemicals, unusual glass containers, and what one shipping manifest cryptically described as substances for the suspension of natural processes. Thomas Hollister's journal, fragments of which were discovered during the reservoir construction, contains numerous references to experiments conducted in the original homestead's cellar. His notes describe attempts to extend the viable properties of tissue beyond expected duration, and observations of unusual cellular activity post-mortem. The journal breaks off abruptly in 1799, though town records show Thomas lived until 1823, an impressive age of 78 at a time when life expectancy was considerably shorter. A letter from Thomas to a European colleague, preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society collection, references an unexpected discovery during his voyage to America in 1793. The ship's log from the merchant vessel Constance notes that they encountered severe storms near the Grand Banks, forcing them off course for several days. During this period, according to the captain's report, they discovered floating debris that appeared to be fragments of an unknown vessel, along with organic materials of indeterminate origin. Thomas Hollister, the only passenger with medical training, reportedly collected several specimens before they continued their journey. The captain's personal journal, accessed during the 1963 investigation, contains a disturbing addendum not included in the official log. Mr. Hollister continues his examination of the materials recovered from the sea. I find myself increasingly disturbed by the specimens, which appear to change in subtle ways between observations. More concerning is Hollister himself, who has not slept in 3 days yet, shows no signs of fatigue. I observe him standing at the rail during night watches, conversing quietly with himself while staring into the water. The textile business came later, established by Thomas's son William in the 1820s. This transition to a more conventional industry coincided with the family's increased social prominence and the construction of the first iteration of the Hollister mansion. Yet architectural records show unusual features incorporated into the new home, including specially designed underground rooms with advanced ventilation systems and walls lined with a composite material imported at great expense from Germany. A letter from William to the architect, preserved in county records, insists that the lower chambers must be constructed precisely to specification, with particular attention to the isolation properties of the walls and the specialized drainage systems. The safety of all depends upon absolute containment. The architect later requested release from the contract, citing unreasonable demands and discomfort with certain aspects of the design. William Hollister completed the construction using workers brought in from outside the region, none of whom settled permanently in the area afterward. Dr. Pierce's journal entries from that first evening describe his exploration of the ground floor. He noted that all mirrors had been removed from their frames, with the empty spaces painted black. In the dining room, he found a table set for 2, the china immaculate, but covered in a fine layer of dust, suggesting it had been arranged weeks earlier. A bound volume on the sideboard contained photographs of the Hollister family dating back to the 1830s. Pierce observed that in every group portrait, one figure appeared, with their face turned slightly away from the camera, as though avoiding direct observation. The library contained an extensive collection of medical texts, many in languages Pierce couldn't identify. He noted several volumes on cellular biology that appeared decades ahead of current scientific understanding, with publication dates from small European printing houses that had no record in any standard bibliography. One particularly worn volume, which Pierce described as bound in material that resembles leather but possesses unusual tactile properties, contained detailed anatomical drawings of structures that corresponded to no known human organ systems. As night fell, Pierce documented hearing movement in the walls, which he initially attributed to the settling of the old house. However, his notes become increasingly agitated as he describes how these sounds seem to follow him from room to room, always emanating from the space directly behind him. At 10:13 p.m., according to his meticulous timeline, all sounds ceased simultaneously. The grandfather clock, the creaking floorboards, even the wind outside the windows fell silent. 3 minutes later, a bell rang from deeper within the house. Following the sound, Dr. Pierce discovered a previously overlooked corridor leading to the eastern wing. The medical examiner's subsequent report notes that this section of the house showed signs of recent renovation, with fresher paint and newer floorboards than the main structure. The corridor terminated at a black door with an unusual lock mechanism that required 2 keys used simultaneously. Both keys lay on a small table beside the door, arranged in a perfect parallel formation. The corridor itself exhibited several unusual features that Pierce documented in detail. The walls appeared to be lined with a material that dampened sound, creating an unsettling pocket of silence as he moved farther from the main house. Temperature readings taken with his pocket thermometer showed a steady decrease from 68 degrees at the corridor's entrance to 58 degrees near the black door, despite no apparent source of cooling. Most disturbing were the subtle architectural anomalies that became more pronounced as he approached the door. The corridor appeared straight to casual observation, but Pierce's measurements revealed a gentle curve that should have intersected with the house's exterior wall if extended logically. Similarly, the ceiling seemed to lower imperceptibly, creating a subconscious sensation of increasing pressure that Pierce described as a growing weight upon the mind rather than the body. Beyond the door, Pierce found Abigail Hollister seated at a writing desk, her back to him. The room contained no electric lights, only candles that cast elongated shadows across the walls. According to his account, she did not immediately acknowledge his presence, continuing to write in a leather-bound journal for several minutes before finally speaking, without turning. "Edmund," she said, "you've always been the rational one in the family. That's why it must be you." The room where Abigail worked was unlike any other in the mansion. Pierce described its dimensions as challenging to the eye, with corners that seemed more or less acute than 90 degrees, creating a subtle disorientation. The walls featured unusual acoustical properties. Whispers from one side carried clearly to the opposite wall while being inaudible at points between. Most notably, Pierce observed that the shadows cast by the candles didn't always move in accordance with the flames flickering, occasionally appearing to shift independently. A large map dominated one wall, showing the Hollister family tree extending back to the 1600s. Unlike conventional genealogical records, this diagram included unusual symbols and notations beside certain names. Red threads connected seemingly unrelated family members across generations, forming a secondary pattern that Pierce described as reminiscent of a neural network rather than a family tree. Certain branches had been heavily annotated in a script that combined conventional Latin characters with symbols Pierce couldn't identify. Town records confirmed that Abigail Hollister, born in 1857, had attended Radcliffe College, unusual for women of her era. Her thesis on hereditary patterns in New England families remains in the college archives, though access has been restricted since 1962 by request of the Hollister estate trustees. Professor Williams of Harvard, who reviewed the work in 1959, described it as disturbing in its implications and suggesting research methods that raise significant ethical concerns. Abigail's academic records, recovered during the 1963 investigation, reveal that her professors had mixed reactions to her work. One evaluation praises her extraordinary insights into cellular propagation and tissue adaptation, while another expresses concern about her unhealthy preoccupation with post-mortem cellular viability and hereditary transfer mechanisms. Her advisor noted that she frequently requested access to specimens that would normally be reserved for advanced medical students, particularly those related to unusual cellular anomalies and tissue preservation. Abigail's personal correspondence, recovered from her desk after subsequent events, reveals her preoccupation with family lineage and what she referred to as the persistence of traits across generations. A letter to a European medical researcher, dated 1899, inquires about documented cases of physical characteristics manifesting after death. The researcher's response is not included in the preserved records. When Abigail finally turned to face her cousin, more disturbing was her physical stillness. In his journal, Pierce observed that she seemed to breathe only when consciously remembering to do so. Her eyes, according to Pierce's detailed description, appeared unnaturally clear, lacking the typical minute blood vessels visible in the sclera. He also noted that her pupils responded to changes in light with a fluid motion more reminiscent of a camera aperture than the human iris. When she finally spoke at length, her voice exhibited unusual modulation, starting with a conventional timbre, but occasionally shifting to include what Pierce described as harmonics that seemed to bypass the ear and resonate directly within the bones of the skull. Abigail explained that she had summoned him to serve as witness and executor of certain family matters that required medical expertise. Pierce noted that she appeared significantly older than her 45 years, with deep lines etched into her face and completely white hair. She spoke of a family inheritance that had manifested across generations of Hollisters, becoming more pronounced with each successive branch of the family tree. According to the partial transcripts of their conversation preserved in Pierce's notes, she referred to this inheritance not as wealth, but as a persistent alteration. "Our family carries something unique," she told him. "It began with Thomas after his voyage, though we found evidence in historical records suggesting similar manifestations in our European ancestors. It affects each of us differently, but the progression follows a consistent pattern over generations. We've managed it through careful documentation, selective breeding, and containment where necessary." The Hollister family cemetery, located on the eastern edge of the property, contained 27 marked graves dating back to 1794. County records show that in 1883, Abigail had commissioned the construction of a substantial family crypt with unusual specifications, including a ventilation system and what the builder's contract referred to as specialized containment architecture. The crypt required importing stone from Vermont that matched precise density requirements outlined in Abigail's 12-page specification document. Newspaper archives from the Worcester Telegram mentioned the construction only briefly, noting that the project continued at all hours, even during inclement weather, and that several workers left the job before completion, citing no specific reasons. One worker, Joseph Merrick, reportedly sought treatment at a Worcester hospital 2 weeks after leaving the Hollister project. Hospital records accessed during the 1963 investigation note that Merrick complained of disturbing dreams and sensations of movement beneath his skin. The attending physician diagnosed nervous exhaustion and prescribed rest. Merrick checked himself out against medical advice and, according to local records, left the state entirely. His subsequent whereabouts remained unknown. The architectural plans for the crypt, sealed by court order in 1904 but briefly accessed during the 1963 investigation, reveal a structure far more complex than its above-ground appearance suggested. Beneath the visible mausoleum lay 3 additional levels, each with progressively more elaborate containment features. The lowest level included what the plans labeled as observation chambers, sealed rooms with specialized glass viewing ports and mechanical systems for atmospheric regulation, and fluid drainage. Most disturbing was a notation on the final page of the blueprints, apparently added in Abigail's handwriting. Dimensions must account for continued expansion. Previous estimates proved insufficient by year 7. The inheritance manifests differently in each generation, Abigail told Dr. Then comes the sensitivity to light, the altered reflection, and finally, the hunger. She proceeded to explain that the hunger wasn't a conventional desire for food, but rather what she described as a cellular imperative toward absorption and reorganization. Early Hollister family journals, which she provided for Pierce's examination, documented cases of family members who had been allowed to progress through this stage, resulting in what one account from 1812 described as complete transformation of physical structure and dissolution of prior personality, according to Dr. Pierce. But the pattern remains consistent. It begins with dreams of hollow spaces. Pierce's increasingly distressed journal entries, Abigail led him to her private study, where decades of research lay meticulously organized. Family medical records, correspondence with specialists across Europe, and detailed observations of Hollister family members filled dozens of bound volumes. One entire bookshelf contained journals labeled only with dates, spanning from 1872 to the present year. Pierce noted that the handwriting in these journals changed subtly over time, becoming increasingly precise and angular. Our ancestors recognized the pattern centuries ago, Abigail explained, according to Pierce's account. They developed methods to manage it, to contain it within the family line. But management is not cure, Edmund, and I have reason to believe I am the last who remembers the methods. The study contained specialized equipment that Pierce, despite his medical training, struggled to identify. Glass containers connected by copper tubing housed what appeared to be tissue samples, suspended in clear fluid. A modified microscope included unusual attachments that Abigail explained were designed to detect cellular activities invisible under conventional magnification. Most prominent was a large device resembling an electrical transformer, which hummed at a barely perceptible frequency. Abigail referred to this as the inhibitor, explaining that it generated fields that slowed certain biological processes. Pierce's examination of the research materials revealed a disturbing progression in the family's condition over generations. Thomas Hollister's initial symptoms, documented in his private journals, had manifested in his late 60s and progressed slowly over decades. His son William began experiencing changes in his 40s with more pronounced physical alterations. By Abigail's generation, the first signs appeared in early adulthood, with full manifestation potentially occurring within years rather than decades. Abigail's research included extensive correspondence with medical specialists across Europe and even as far as India. One letter from a doctor, Heinrich Müller of Vienna, referenced experiments with cellular persistence beyond conventional mortality and suggested that the Hollister case might represent an unprecedented example of evolutionary divergence. Müller requested specimens, which Abigail apparently declined to provide. His final letter expressed both disappointment and relief at her refusal. Among the most disturbing documents in Abigail's collection was a family tree dating back to the 1600s in England. Unlike conventional genealogical records, this diagram included unusual notations beside certain names, symbols that Dr. Pierce described as reminiscent of medical shorthand but significantly altered. More alarming were the lines connecting certain family members, not by birth or marriage, but by what Abigail's notes referred to as transmission events. These events often coincided with deaths in the family, followed by unexplained illnesses among surviving members. The local weather record notes that on the second night of Dr. Pierce's stay, an unusual fog descended over the Hollister property, so dense that lamps were barely visible at 10 paces. The groundskeeper's log describes the fog as clinging to the skin like oil and seeming to pulse with the rhythm of breath. That night, Abigail guided Dr. Pierce to the family crypt. His notes describe a structure far more extensive than its external appearance suggested, with a series of descending chambers accessed through an elaborate locking mechanism built into the stone floor of the main crypt. The air grew increasingly cold as they descended, yet remained unusually dry. The exterior of the crypt presented a conventional appearance, a neoclassical structure of Vermont marble featuring the Hollister family name above the entrance. Inside, however, Pierce encountered a space that defied architectural logic. The main chamber contained traditional burial niches, but the central floor featured an intricate design inlaid with different types of stone, forming a pattern similar to the family crest. When Abigail activated a hidden mechanism, sections of this floor reconfigured themselves, revealing a spiral staircase descending into darkness. Pierce noted that the stone steps were worn in a pattern inconsistent with normal use, with depressions not in the center but along the edges, as though those who descended preferred to maintain constant contact with the walls. The first subterranean level contained what appeared to be a research laboratory with equipment dating from various periods. Pierce recognized some instruments from medical practice, while others appeared custom-built for purposes he couldn't determine. Detailed anatomical drawings covered one wall, showing human figures in various stages of what the labels described as transition. The drawings became progressively less recognizably human in the later stages. Abigail led him deeper through additional security mechanisms that required both physical keys and what Pierce described as specific sequencing of actions, as though the facility were testing not just possession of tools, but knowledge of methods. The air quality changed noticeably with each level, becoming increasingly processed, neither stale nor fresh, but bearing subtle chemical notes that Pierce compared to hospital preservation rooms. In the lowest chamber, they found 7 coffins arranged in a precise circular pattern. Unlike traditional caskets, these were constructed of metal, with glass observation panels and complex locking mechanisms. According to Pierce's increasingly fragmented notes, Abigail approached the central coffin and activated a mechanism that caused the glass panel to slide open. "The body does not die," she told him, "not completely. Something remains and continues to change." This is the true Hollister inheritance. What Dr. Pierce observed in that coffin was documented in a separate journal, which he later sealed with wax and instructed his attorney to destroy upon his death. The attorney failed to follow these instructions, instead depositing the journal with the Massachusetts Historical Society in 1924 under restricted access. In 1963, the journal was removed from the Society's collection by federal authorities, citing public health concerns. Its current location remains unknown. The only surviving excerpt, quoted in a private letter from the attorney to a colleague, describes tissue that should be long decayed instead showing signs of alteration and adaptation. The cellular structure appears to be reorganizing itself according to some incomprehensible pattern, creating channels and chambers where none should exist. The coffin contained the remains of Jonathan Hollister, Abigail's father, who had died in 1879, 23 years earlier. According to conventional understanding, only skeletal remains should have been present. Instead, Pierce described tissue with unusual elasticity and areas that appeared to be developing new structures with no analog in human anatomy. Most disturbing was his observation of movement, subtle pulsations and shifts that occurred without any apparent external stimulus. According to local weather records, thunder shook the region that night, despite there being no reported lightning. Several residents of Hollister mentioned in personal correspondence sounds like distant screams carried on the wind from the direction of the estate. Each of the 7 coffins contained remains in different stages of what Abigail's research termed the continuation. The most recent interment, a cousin who had died in 1898, showed the least advanced changes. The oldest, dating to 1843, contained something Pierce struggled to describe in scientific terms, referring instead to organic architecture and a system of tissues that suggests purpose without revealing function. Abigail explained to her cousin that for generations the Hollister family had managed this persistence after death through careful monitoring and containment. Each generation appointed a caretaker who would remain unmarried and without children, dedicated solely to maintaining the family's secrets. Abigail had served in this capacity since her father's death in 1879. Now, approaching her own mortality, she required a successor. "The inheritance grows stronger with each generation," she told Pierce. "Those in the coffins below are from the previous generation. The changes manifested slowly, over decades. But my father's transformation began within hours of apparent death. Mine will likely be faster still." As they examined the containment facilities, Abigail provided a historical context that deepened Pierce's growing horror. The inheritance, as she called it, had first manifested in Thomas Hollister after his encounter with unknown materials at sea. His journals described dreams that became increasingly vivid, in which he received instruction from within regarding methods to preserve and propagate the gift. Thomas had discovered that the condition could be transmitted in two ways: through direct bloodline inheritance, which produced a slower, more manageable progression, or through a process he cryptically described as consumption of essence, which created a more immediate but unstable transformation. The family had established strict protocols to prevent the latter while managing the former, including the construction of specialized containment facilities that evolved with each generation's understanding of the phenomenon. Most alarmingly, Abigail revealed that several breaches had occurred throughout the family's history. In 1832, a groundskeeper had accidentally gained access to a primitive containment area and subsequently vanished, along with the remains he had discovered. 3 months later, a series of unusual deaths in a village 30 miles away prompted William Hollister to investigate. His private records, which Abigail showed to Pierce, documented his discovery of an evolved form that had established itself beneath an abandoned mill. William's journal ended with a detailed account of using specialized chemicals to destroy the entity, followed by his systematic elimination of everyone in the village who had come in contact with it. The third day of Dr. Pierce's visit coincided with what meteorological records describe as unusually vibrant aurora borealis activity over Massachusetts, an exceedingly rare phenomenon that far south. The display reportedly focused most intensely over the northern section of Worcester County, where the Hollister estate was located. That morning, Abigail presented Dr. Pierce with a choice: become the next caretaker of the Hollister legacy or help her end the family line permanently. According to his notes, she had spent decades searching for a method to genuinely terminate the persistence rather than merely contain it. Her research had led her to believe that complete cellular destruction was the only effective approach. "I've tried everything," she told him: extreme heat, conventional acids, even radiation from those new materials being studied in Europe. They slow the process but never truly stop it. Only complete molecular disruption seems effective, and I finally synthesized compounds that might accomplish this. The Worcester County Chemical Supply Registry shows a delivery of concentrated acids and industrial solvents to the Hollister estate 2 weeks prior to Dr. Pierce's arrival. Building permits from the same period indicate modifications to the drainage system beneath the family crypt, connecting it to a deeper chamber blasted from the bedrock. "I have made preparations for either outcome," Abigail told him, "but the decision must be made today. I can feel the change beginning already." She showed him her forearm, where the skin had developed a subtle translucency, revealing tissues beneath that moved in patterns inconsistent with normal circulatory or muscular function. When Pierce examined her with his stethoscope, he documented hearing not a conventional heartbeat but a complex rhythm of pulses, as though multiple independent systems were operating in coordinated sequence. Dr. Pierce's final journal entry from the Hollister estate is dated 10:37 a.m. on June 17, 1902. It reads simply, "God forgive me for what I must do. There are greater horrors than death and some inheritances that must not continue." At 2:13 a.m. on June 18th, residents of Hollister reported a column of unusual green-tinted smoke rising from the direction of the estate. The local fire brigade was dispatched but found the main house intact. The family crypt, however, had collapsed inward, leaving a charred depression in the earth. Chemical analysis of soil samples, conducted as part of the subsequent investigation, revealed extreme acidity and compounds that the laboratory technician described as inconsistent with known organic decomposition. The fire brigade captain's report, filed the following day, contained several disturbing observations omitted from the official town record. He described the smoke as moving against the wind and noted that his men experienced unusual physical sensations in proximity to the collapsed crypt, including vibrations within the bones and momentary doublings of vision. Most significantly, he reported that the depression left by the collapse seemed to be actively stabilizing itself, with the surrounding soil shifting to create a more geometrically precise boundary than would occur naturally. Dr. Edmund Pierce left Hollister that morning, according to the stationmaster's log at the local railway depot. He resigned from his medical practice the following week and purchased a remote property in northern Vermont, where he lived in isolation until his death in 1919. His death certificate, signed by a local physician, notes extreme premature aging as a contributing factor, despite Pierce being only 58 years old. The attending physician's private correspondence, discovered during a 1962 review of the case, describes unusual physical characteristics observed during Pierce's final examination. These included unusually resilient tissue, atypical vascular structures, and areas of skin with peculiar translucency. The physician apparently collected tissue samples for further study, but these were reportedly destroyed in a laboratory fire 3 days after Pierce's death. The fire was attributed to faulty electrical wiring. In the months following the incident at the Hollister estate, several unusual events occurred in the surrounding area. Local newspaper archives mentioned 3 separate cases of grave disturbance in nearby cemeteries, though nothing was reportedly taken or vandalized. A local doctor documented an increase in patients reporting sleep disturbances and unusual sensations beneath the skin, particularly among those living closest to the Hollister property. The estate itself remained abandoned for several years. Tax records show that ownership transferred to a trust managed by a Boston law firm, with no clear connection to the Hollister family. The trust paid for minimal maintenance, but prohibited any entry to the main house or the grounds surrounding the collapsed crypt. In 1907, a researcher from Harvard University, Dr. James Montague, petitioned for access to the estate as part of a study on architectural acoustics in historic New England structures. His request was initially denied, but eventually granted with severe restrictions, including prohibition from entering the eastern wing or any below-ground spaces. Montague's subsequent report, submitted to the university but never published, describes highly unusual sound propagation patterns throughout the mansion. He noted that certain rooms seemed to amplify sounds from distant parts of the house while completely dampening others occurring nearby. Most significantly, he documented audible rhythmic patterns emanating from behind the sealed entrance to the eastern wing, reminiscent of circulatory processes, but at a much slower tempo. University records indicate that Montague requested funding for a follow-up study, but was denied. He subsequently took a leave of absence for health reasons and never returned to his academic position. His personal journals from this period, preserved in his family's private collection, contain increasingly paranoid entries about being followed by something that moves just out of sight and dreaming of hollow spaces that should not exist. Between 1910 and 1927, the Hollister estate changed ownership several times, with no owner residing on the property for more than 18 months. Local records show a pattern of initial renovation efforts followed by abrupt abandonment. One owner, a Boston industrialist named Harrington, wrote to the county clerk requesting information about unusual structural features beneath the house. His subsequent correspondence mentions discovering sealed chambers and his intention to open them for additional storage. No further letters from Harrington appear in the record, and the property was sold at auction 3 months later after he disappeared, leaving all his belongings in the house. The Hollister estate remained abandoned until the 1930s, when the entire area was evacuated to create the Quabbin Reservoir. Before the waters rose, several unusual incidents were reported by the demolition crews. Workers described finding rooms that didn't appear on any floor plan, and several refused to enter the lower levels of the house entirely. One foreman's report mentions unusual preservation of wooden elements that should have rotted decades earlier. When demolition reached the eastern wing, 3 workers were reportedly hospitalized after breaking through a sealed wall and being exposed to what official reports described as noxious gases from decayed materials. Hospital records accessed during the 1963 investigation tell a different story. The attending physician noted that all 3 men exhibited symptoms inconsistent with gas exposure, including unusual dermal elasticity and subcutaneous structures not consistent with normal human anatomy. All 3 workers were transferred to a specialized medical facility in Boston 3 days after their admission. No further records of their treatment or condition exist in public archives. Their families reported receiving generous financial settlements from an anonymous source, conditional upon signing non-disclosure agreements. The demolition of the Hollister estate was never completed according to plan. Engineering reports indicate that after the incident with the workers, authorities decided to prioritize the reservoir timeline, leaving the deeper foundations and underground structures in place to be covered by the rising water. One supervisor's note found in state archives during the 1963 investigation questions this decision. Given what we found in the lower levels, burial beneath water seems an inadequate containment strategy. These structures should be completely destroyed, not merely submerged. The supervisor who wrote this note, Harold Wilson, was reassigned to a different project the following day. His personal journal, discovered among his effects after his death in 1959, describes what the demolition team encountered in the sealed eastern wing. Rooms that make no architectural sense, with dimensions that seem to shift when not directly observed, materials that don't match any known construction technique, and the patterns on the walls and floors, organic structures that no human would design, as though the building itself were trying to grow into something else. As the reservoir filling began in 1939, engineers noted unusual difficulties in the area directly over the former Hollister property. Water levels rose more slowly than projected, as though the ground were absorbing the liquid at an unexpected rate. Soil samples showed normal composition, leading to speculation about undetected caverns or porous bedrock formations beneath the estate grounds. More concerning were the reports from divers tasked with final inspections of submerged structures. According to their logs, several refused to make second dives to the Hollister foundations, citing equipment malfunctions and disorienting conditions. One diver's report mentions structures that weren't visible from the surface and unusual water movement, like currents flowing in circular patterns around specific points on the estate grounds. The project supervisor eventually abandoned further inspections of the area, citing safety concerns. His final report includes a recommendation that the area above the former Hollister property be designated as a no-anchoring zone once the reservoir was complete, ostensibly due to submerged hazards. Internal memoranda suggest the real concern was disturbing whatever remained of the estate's unusual underground structures. In 1946, 7 years after the reservoir reached its planned capacity, a routine water quality test detected unusual organic compounds in samples taken from the area above the submerged Hollister property. These compounds were described as potentially biological in origin, but not matching known bacterial, algal, or fungal profiles. Subsequent tests showed these compounds had dissipated, and the matter was not pursued further. However, internal memoranda from the Water Authority, classified until 1967, reveal ongoing monitoring of that specific area of the reservoir. These documents reference intermittent anomalies in both water composition and sonar depth readings. One particularly concerned report notes that during periods of low water levels, the ground above the former Hollister estate appeared to shift configuration between soundings, as though the underlying structures were rearranging themselves. A 1952 incident, mentioned only in private correspondence between water authority officials, describes a maintenance boat that experienced complete electrical failure while passing over the submerged estate. The crew reported that in the minutes before the failure, their depth finder showed impossible readings, indicating both extreme depths and, simultaneously, solid structures just below the surface. Most disturbing was their observation that the water around their vessel began to exhibit unusual viscosity and a subtle luminescence that persisted for several minutes after they drifted away from the area. Following this incident, the Water Authority established a restricted zone over the former Hollister property, prohibiting both recreational and research vessels without special authorization. Public records attribute this restriction to underwater debris posing navigation hazards, but internal documents reveal more specific concerns about potential containment failures and anomalous energy signatures. Between 1953 and 1960, the authority conducted periodic specialized testing in the restricted zone. These tests, according to declassified reports, included sampling for non-standard biological markers and monitoring for electrical and magnetic anomalies. The results show a pattern of intermittent spikes in activity, often corresponding with significant changes in reservoir levels or unusual weather patterns. One researcher, Dr. Eleanor Wright, dedicated 3 years to studying these anomalies before her funding was abruptly terminated in 1958. Her final report, heavily redacted before partial release in 1972, describes observing organized patterns of activity beneath the reservoir surface that suggest purposeful modification of the environment rather than random natural processes. Her recommendations included establishing a permanent research station to monitor what she described as a potentially significant evolutionary anomaly developing in isolation. Instead, all research was discontinued, and the restricted zone was expanded. Internal memoranda reveal that this decision came after Dr. Wright's team captured sonar images showing structures beneath the reservoir floor that appeared to have expanded beyond the original foundations of the Hollister estate, with extensions that resembled root-like growths penetrating deeper into the bedrock. In 1962, during a period of drought that lowered the reservoir levels significantly, a research team from Miskatonic University conducted a limited underwater survey of the submerged town. Their sonar readings detected an anomalous structure extending much deeper into the bedrock than any building foundation should reach. Their request for funding to investigate further was denied by state authorities. The team's raw data, preserved in university archives, reveals more than their published findings indicate. The sonar images show structures with characteristics inconsistent with human architecture, curved surfaces that form complex interlocking patterns, chambers that appear to pulsate slightly between successive scans, and tunnel systems that extend for miles beyond the original Hollister property boundaries. Professor Martin Chambers, who led the research team, wrote in his private journal, "What lies beneath the Quabbin is not ruins, but something actively growing. The Hollister estate appears to be merely the surface expression of a much larger system that continues to develop even now." Most concerning are the patterns of this development, which suggest not random expansion, but purposeful adaptation to the surrounding environment. One member of that research team, Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, continued unauthorized investigations on her own. Her private journals, discovered after her disappearance in 1964, describe night dives in the restricted area of the reservoir. Her final entry details discovering an opening where solid stone should exist and her plans to explore it the following night. She was never seen again. The official search for Dr. Morgan lasted 3 weeks before being called off due to dangerous underwater conditions. The dive team reported unusual difficulties in the area, including equipment malfunctions and disorientation even among experienced divers. One diver described the water as having unusual viscosity and seeming to resist certain movements while facilitating others. The search team's classified report, partially declassified in 1980, contains disturbing observations omitted from public records. Divers reported hearing rhythmic sounds underwater that seemed to come from all directions simultaneously. Several experienced hallucinations described as intrusive imagery of branching, hollow structures that persisted even after they returned to the surface. Most significantly, 2 divers reported brief sightings of a pale figure moving at depths where visibility should have been impossible, swimming with movements unlike any human diver. The search was officially abandoned after one dive team disappeared for 45 minutes longer than their air supply should have allowed. When they finally surfaced, they had no memory of the missing time, and their diving equipment showed unusual deterioration as though exposed to corrosive substances. Medical examinations revealed elevated white blood cell counts and unexplained subcutaneous nodules that spontaneously disappeared over the following weeks. The official record ends there. But in 1967, a night watchman at the Quabbin Reservoir filed an unusual incident report describing lights moving beneath the surface of the water over the location of the former Hollister property. The report was subsequently removed from official files but referenced in the watchman's personal journal, which surfaced at an estate sale in 1993. His final entry on the matter reads, "Whatever the water was meant to keep buried isn't resting quietly. Some things persist even when they should be long dead." The watchman, Samuel Graves, continued making unofficial observations for several years after being instructed to discontinue his reports on unusual phenomena. His personal journals describe a pattern of activity beneath the reservoir that intensified during certain lunar phases and weather conditions. He noted that the lights he observed appeared to follow specific patterns, forming geometric shapes that became increasingly complex over time. Most disturbing were his observations during the winter of 1968, when portions of the reservoir froze. Graves documented unusual patterns in the ice formation over the Hollister property, areas that remained liquid despite temperatures well below freezing, and crystalline structures within the ice that formed patterns similar to organic tissue when viewed from certain angles. His journal contains detailed sketches of these formations, which he described as reminiscent of microscopic views of cellular structures, but on a massive scale. Graves was found dead in his home in February 1969, officially attributed to a heart attack. However, the responding officer's personal correspondence mentions finding Graves' body in an unusual state, completely rigid, but with joints still flexible, skin with an odd translucent quality, and eyes that appeared to have developed additional structural features within the iris. The officer requested a specialized autopsy, but records indicate the body was cremated within 24 hours by order of the State Department of Public Health. In the decades following, local folklore around the Quabbin Reservoir began to incorporate elements of what became known as the Hollister story. Fishermen reported unusual cold spots on the water, even during summer months. Several described their boats being drawn toward certain areas despite motor power or prevailing currents working against this movement. In 1975, a group of college students attempted to camp on one of the small islands that formed when the reservoir was created, formerly high ground near the Hollister property. They were evacuated by park rangers for safety reasons, but not before reporting unusual ground movement beneath their tents, and collecting soil samples that reportedly contained fibrous material with properties similar to both plant roots and animal tissue. The samples were confiscated by authorities and never returned. A journal kept by one of the students, Michael Chen, contains detailed observations of their brief stay on the island. He described a persistent humming sensation felt through the ground rather than heard, and noticed that electronic equipment, including watches and radios, functioned erratically. Most significantly, he documented unusual dreams shared by all four campers, dreams featuring vast networks of connected chambers and flowing living architecture that seemed to be growing and evolving. Local authorities attributed these reports to the power of suggestion and the island's proximity to decomposing organic matter from the pre-reservoir forest. However, internal communications reveal that soil samples from the island were sent to a specialized research facility for analysis. The results remain classified, but a memo referencing the findings mentions highly unusual cellular structures suggesting active reconfiguration of standard biological materials along novel organizational patterns. Through the 1980s, several independent researchers attempted to investigate the Hollister case, often focusing on historical records rather than the reservoir itself due to access restrictions. One particularly thorough study by historian Dr. Rebecca Santos traced property records and family histories throughout the region, discovering that several families who had lived near the Hollister estate exhibited unusual patterns of illness, relocation, and, in some cases, complete disappearance from public records. Most notable was the Wilson family, who had owned the adjacent property from 1872 to 1897. Santos discovered medical records indicating that several family members had been treated for unusual dermal conditions and internal restructuring of unknown etiology. The family abruptly left the area in 1897, changing their name and relocating to Western Canada. Santos's attempts to contact their descendants were met with immediate legal action from an unidentified source, forcing her to abandon that line of research. To this day, local fishing guides refuse to take boats over certain sections of the reservoir, citing unexplained equipment malfunctions and water that feels wrong. Sonar equipment reportedly returns inconsistent depth readings in these areas, sometimes indicating chambers or spaces where solid earth should exist. In 1990, a commercial fishing boat reported their nets returning with unusual material described as neither plant nor animal tissue, but possessing characteristics of both. Analysis by a marine biology laboratory indicated cellular structures unlike any known organism, with properties suggesting an ability to alter their configuration in response to environmental stimuli. Before further studies could be conducted, the samples were confiscated by individuals claiming to represent the State Environmental Protection Agency. No record of these individuals exists in official employment files. Perhaps most disturbing is the series of unusual medical cases reported at hospitals surrounding the Quabbin region between 1970 and 1963. 17 patients presented with symptoms that included sensitivity to light, unusual dermal resilience, and what one doctor described as cellular patterns inconsistent with normal human physiology. Genealogical research conducted by a graduate student in 1963 suggested that each of these individuals had ancestors from the town of Hollister, though this connection was never officially acknowledged. The student's thesis was never published, and university records indicate she left the program abruptly mid-semester. Her current whereabouts remain unknown. According to sealed medical records, accessed briefly during a 1982 public health review, these patients exhibited a consistent progression of symptoms. Initial complaints typically involved unusual dreams and a sensitivity to light, followed by alterations in skin texture and unexplained modifications to internal organs as revealed by medical imaging. The final stages, documented in only 3 cases, involved what attending physicians described as fundamental reorganization of cellular structures and development of previously unidentified tissues with no clear analogs in known human anatomy. All patients in advanced stages were transferred to specialized research facilities, after which no further public records exist. Families reported being told their relatives had succumbed to rare genetic disorders with remains cremated for public health reasons. Several families received unexpected financial support from anonymous sources, often coinciding with their relocation away from the Quabbin region. In 1985, a hydrologist studying water flow patterns in the reservoir noted that the area above the former Hollister property maintained a temperature approximately 3 degrees warmer than surrounding waters, regardless of season or weather conditions. His request to investigate this anomaly further was denied, and he was reassigned to a different project. In his private correspondence, he expressed concern that something beneath the reservoir appears to be generating heat, suggesting metabolic processes on a scale difficult to comprehend. Satellite thermal imaging from 1989, classified until 2001, confirms this temperature anomaly and reveals that it expanded gradually throughout the 1980s. The pattern of this expansion corresponds closely with the root-like structures detected by sonar imaging in the 1960s, suggesting continued growth of whatever remained of the Hollister legacy beneath the reservoir. Water quality reports from 1993 to 1995 show intermittent spikes in unusual organic compounds in the reservoir, particularly in areas furthest from the Hollister property. Analysis of these compounds reveals molecular structures similar to those documented in Abigail Hollister's research notes, suggesting a gradual diffusion throughout the water system. Public health officials increased filtration and monitoring, but made no public announcement regarding these findings. In 1998, during another period of significant drought, exposed shoreline near the former Hollister property yielded several unusual artifacts collected by local residents before authorities secured the area. These included metal fragments with glass inserts containing what witnesses described as still-moving tissue and stone tablets inscribed with symbols matching those in Abigail Hollister's research journals. All items were confiscated, and those who had handled them were subjected to medical observation for several weeks. One collector, James Porter, refused to surrender a small metal device he had found. 3 weeks later, he was hospitalized with symptoms including structural alterations to dermal tissue and unusual growths within the abdominal cavity. Surgical attempts to remove these growths were unsuccessful, as they appeared to integrate with surrounding tissues more quickly than they could be excised. Porter disappeared from the hospital after 2 months of treatment, with records indicating he had checked himself out against medical advice. His home was found abandoned, with journals describing progressive physical changes and a growing awareness of previously unknown bodily capabilities. In 2002, exactly 100 years after the events at the Hollister estate, residents around the Quabbin Reservoir reported an unusual phenomenon: dreams featuring vast underwater structures and entities that communicated without speaking. Local medical professionals attributed this to media coverage of the centennial of the Hollister incident in historical journals, but internal public health memoranda reveal concern about the consistency of the imagery across unrelated individuals. The dreams followed a consistent pattern, beginning with visions of hollow chambers connected by flowing passages, and progressing to encounters with entities described as humanoid but altered, with tissues that flowed and reformed rather than maintaining fixed structure. Most disturbing was the final stage, in which dreamers reported receiving information about structural reconfiguration and imperative knowledge about an impending emergence. The study was discontinued after several researchers began experiencing the dreams themselves. A confidential study conducted by the State Department of Mental Health documented over 200 cases of these dreams within a 30-mile radius of the reservoir. Internal correspondence reveals that all personnel involved were reassigned and required to sign enhanced confidentiality agreements. Several subsequently relocated to distant states, breaking contact with former colleagues and family members. In 2004, a group of independent researchers attempted to correlate historical records of the Hollister family with similar cases worldwide. Their findings, never formally published, but circulated in specialized academic circles, identified 7 other family lines with similar patterns: unusual longevity, distinctive physical characteristics that intensified over generations, and architectural anomalies in family residences suggesting specialized containment structures. 5 of these family lines had apparently died out between the 18th and 20th centuries, often ending with unexplained fires, chemical accidents, or entire family groups disappearing simultaneously. The remaining 2 had scattered during the mid-20th century, their descendants difficult to trace. The researchers noted that in each case, family dissolution had been followed by unusual regional phenomena, geological anomalies, unexplained biological occurrences, or localized atmospheric disturbances. Most significantly, the research team discovered references to the aquatic branch in documents related to one of the European family lines. These fragmentary records from the mid-1700s describe an offshoot of the family that returned to water after achieving complete transformation. The documents suggest that this branch continued to evolve in isolation, developing capabilities far beyond those documented in the land-dwelling lineages. The final reference, dated 1789, warns of the potential for reemergence when conditions align and advises maintaining vigilance over deep waters where ancient structures lie hidden. Environmental monitoring of the Quabbin Reservoir intensified in the early 2000s with specialized equipment installed to detect unusual biological and chemical signatures. Official reports show only standard fluctuations in water quality, but classified data reveals intermittent detection of compounds matching those described in Abigail Hollister's research, complex organic molecules with properties suggesting both biological and synthetic origins. Most concerning are sonar surveys conducted between 2005 and 2010, which show significant expansion of the anomalous structures beneath the reservoir floor. What began as root-like extensions from the original Hollister foundations has developed into an extensive network of chambers and passages extending throughout the bedrock beneath the reservoir. The pattern of this network bears striking similarities to neural structures when analyzed by specialized software, suggesting a system designed for information processing and distribution rather than mere physical expansion. In 2012, 3 research divers disappeared while conducting an unauthorized exploration near the restricted zone. Their equipment was recovered 2 weeks later, showing signs of unusual degradation and containing recording devices that had been completely erased. The official investigation attributed their disappearance to equipment failure and disorientation, but internal reports note that all 3 had experienced the characteristic dreams in the weeks preceding their dive and had expressed interest in making contact with whatever exists beneath the reservoir. Some inheritances are carried not in the blood or in legal documents, but in something more fundamental, in the very structure of what makes us human. And sometimes that inheritance refuses to be diluted, even across generations or through the barrier between life and what should be death. For those who know where to look, the signs of the Hollister legacy continue. They persist, adapt, and wait just beneath the surface of our ordinary world. In the depths of the Quabbin, something that was once human, but has become something else entirely, continues its patient transformation. And with each passing year, the waters that contain it grow less effective as a barrier. The most recent water samples, analyzed by independent researchers in 2018, show trace elements of unidentified organic compounds increasing in concentration. The pattern of increase correlates precisely with drought cycles when reservoir levels drop. Whatever remains of the Hollister legacy appears to be reaching upward, gradually extending its influence beyond its watery tomb. Those who know the true history wonder not if, but when the inheritance will fully manifest once more, and whether this time there will be anyone prepared to contain it. In 2020, residents of towns surrounding the reservoir began reporting unusual dreams once again, more vivid and consistent than previous occurrences. These dreams featured not just structures and entities, but specific information, complex molecular configurations, unusual architectural designs, and procedures for what one dreamer described as facilitating the transition from conventional to advanced cellular organization. Most disturbing is the pattern of physical symptoms reported in conjunction with these dreams: subtle changes in skin texture, enhanced night vision, and what medical examinations have identified as novel microstructures within standard tissue samples. These changes appear temporary in most individuals, but persistent in a small percentage, particularly those with genetic connections to the original Hollister region. Recent satellite imaging shows thermal anomalies spreading throughout the reservoir in patterns that environmental scientists cannot explain through conventional water movement or geological processes. The patterns form complex geometric structures that reconfigure themselves over time, suggesting coordinated activity rather than random natural phenomena. Water quality monitoring has detected increasing concentrations of the unusual organic compounds, now present throughout the reservoir rather than localized to the Hollister area. Filtration systems designed to remove these compounds show decreasing effectiveness, as though the molecules were adapting to circumvent these barriers. They describe these figures as human in general form but fluid in movement, with a skin that displayed unusual translucency and features that seem to shift slightly when not directly observed. All three individuals experienced vivid dreams following these encounters, featuring detailed information about the coming transition and preparation for a new form of existence. Beneath the placid surface of the Quabbin Reservoir, the Hollister inheritance continues its patient evolution. Most recently, in early 2024, 3 separate individuals with no connection to each other reported encounters with unusual figures near the reservoir shoreline during periods of low water. What began as a singular anomaly in one family line has developed into something far more extensive, a novel form of existence that combines human origin with completely new organizational principles. The containment that Dr. Pierce attempted in 1902 has merely delayed, not prevented, its eventual emergence. And as drought conditions intensify and reservoir levels continue to drop, exposing more of what lies beneath, the barrier between what was once the Hollister legacy and the surrounding world grows thinner. The inheritance, it seems, has not been contained. It has been incubating, growing stronger, and preparing for a more complete manifestation. In the towns surrounding the Quabbin, residents go about their daily lives, drawing water from taps connected to the reservoir, swimming in streams fed by its overflow, and dreaming increasingly of hollow spaces and fluid architectures. The Hollister inheritance spreads, molecule by molecule, dream by dream, preparing for the next stage in its patient evolution. The waters will continue to recede, and what has waited beneath will finally emerge.